can go to for perhaps a day or two, and then they're going to be moved on to other Russian regions for longer-term stay. Now, we have also seen...
Apologies for interrupting that package. We are going to cross live now to an address of the Russian President Vladimir Putin to the nation.
I'll start off by reminding you what I said in my address on February the 21st. I'd like to go back to some of the concerns, the fundamental threats that have gradually evolved, that have been created by irresponsible policymakers in the West vis-à-vis Russia. I'm referring to the enlargement of NATO eastward. It's coming really close to the Russian borders. Over the 30 years, we've been persistently trying, but in vain, to agree on the principles of indivisible and equitable security. We've sent proposals, but we've heard lies or attempts to blackmail and bullying. In the meantime, NATO, despite our concerns and protests, has been expanding steadily. The military machine is moving ahead and, as I said, is coming to our borders. Why is it happening? Why do they have this manner of a bully to speak with us with such insolence? Why don't they care about our interests and legitimate requests and demands? The answer is very simple. The Soviet Union first weakened in the late 80s, and then it actually broke up, and it's a great history lesson for us. A paralysis of power and will is the first stage to degradation and oblivion. Once you lose confidence, and that's it, you're lost. The equilibrium of power in the world was undermined, and the previous arrangements were no longer effective. And the requests, the begging, don't really help. The powers that be can call anything outdated. Hegemons can call anything that no longer exists, and whatever they want is pushed and poised and touted as the ultimate truth. And if you disagree, then you're going to be cracked down, broken over a knee. Well, what I was saying just now concerns not just Russia. It actually is true for the entire system of international relations, and very often it does apply to US allies. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, a redivision of the world began, and international law and key rules were adopted following World War II and certified the outcomes of World War II, stood in the way of those who call themselves the winners in the Cold War. In our practical life, in international relations, well, we could have also taken account of the changes in the world and the new balance, but we had to do it in a patient way, with due respect to the interests of all the nations. And you also have to be aware of your responsibility. However, that did not happen. The euphoria of your ultimate superiority, that's a kind of a contemporary absolutism, and given the overall low cultural level, and they, pushed and pressurized for promoting their own decisions. And so we saw a different scenario playing out. There are a lot of examples. First, they held a bloody military operation against Belgrade without any UN authorizations. They used missiles and air force right in the heart of Europe. several weeks, they bombed cities, civilian infrastructure, essential infrastructure. I'd just like to remind our Western counterparts of these facts. They don't want to be reminded. And when we bring it up, they prefer not to rely on international law. They just try to cite the circumstances that they could interpret in the way they like. Then came Iraq, Libya, Syria, illegitimate use of power against Libya, the misinterpretation, abuse of the UN Security Council decisions led to the complete collapse of the state, and there's a hotbed of international terrorism there. The country is now plunged into a humanitarian catastrophe, and the multi-year civil war is still ongoing. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people are now in a dangerous situation, and we saw massive migration flows from North Africa. Same scenario was prepared for Syria. Military action by the US-led coalition without the authorization of the UN Security Council resolution and the consent of Syrian authorities is an aggression, basically. And the invasion of Iraq, is a standalone case. Again, there was no legal justification. They said that there is some highly likely information that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. And as for evidence, US Secretary of State showed some vial with white powder to the entire world, trying to convince the world that this is the weapons of mass destruction that were developed in Iraq. But it turned out it's a fake. There was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Incredible. So these were lies at the top state level, from the top pedestal from the top rostrum in the UN. And then that led to an outbreak of terrorism. I have an impression that whenever and wherever you have the West coming in, you just have those tragedies and hotbeds of terrorism and extremism. Now, what I mentioned are the most glaring examples, but not the only ones when international law is undermined. And again, they promised not to move NATO not an inch to the east, and they just cheated on us. They just framed us, set us up. They let us down. You often hear that politics is a dirty business. Well, but not to such an extent. Come on, give us a break. And such attitude runs counter to international law, to morale. What about justice? What about the truth? You can only see blatant lies and hypocrisy. And US policymakers, journalists, think tankers say that in the past years, there's an empire of lies in the US. Well, I can only agree with that. That's true. But the US is a great country. It's a systemic power. All of its satellite nations, its proxies, sing along, and they copy its behavior, and they happily borrow the rules that are imposed on them. So you can safely say that the entire Western bloc, shaped by the US, according to its design, is entirely the empire of lies. As for Russia, following the Soviet Union, given the unprecedented openness of contemporary Russia and its readiness to work with the US and other Western partners and unilateral disarmament, they tried to destroy us, to give us the headshot. That was happened in the 1990s and in the early noughties, when the so-called collective West was very active in supporting, nurturing terrorism and gangs of violent extremists in Russia, in the south of Russia. And we had to go through a lot of turbulent events before we broke down the backbone of international terrorism in the Caucasus. We will never forget about it. There have been attempts to use Russia in their own interest, to destroy our traditional values and to impose their own pseudo-values, which would destroy which would be a ticking bomb for the Russian nation. Within the same principles they want to impose on themselves, that they lead to degradation because they run counter to the nature to human nature, and that won't happen. No one in history has been able to do that, and they won't succeed in doing this. But in December 2022, we reached out to the US and their allies to agree on the security principles in Europe and on the attempt to avert any NATO expansion to the east. But it's all in vain. The US doesn't want to agree with us on the key principles and the key concerns. In pursuing their goals, they don't show any respect to our concerns and interests. Well, the big question is, what do we have to expect next? We know that in 1940 and in the early 1941, the Soviet Union tried to avert, or at least to delay, the launch of the war, World War II. And they've tried not to provoke the potential aggressor until the most last moments. And they delayed the steps to prepare for an imminent aggression. And the steps that have been taken were too little too late. Eventually, the country was not ready to face a full-blown invasion by Nazi Germany that launched an aggression against the Soviet Union in the early hours on the 22nd of June 1941. We were able to stop the enemy. The attempt to appease the aggressor ahead of the war was a grave mistake, and it cost us a lot. We lost strategic territories and millions of people in the early months. We will not make such a mistake, such a blunder for a second time. We have no right to do it. Those who lay claims to world hegemony without any grounds call us, Russia, the enemy adversary, and they do have huge financial, scientific, military clout. We are aware of this. We objectively assess the threats against us in the economy. And we're also assess of our abilities and capabilities to withstand that blackmail, that sheer and ruthless blackmail. We are pretty realistic about those assessments. As for the military, even following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the loss of a lot of capacity, Russia is one of the most powerful nuclear countries around the world, and it has certain advantages in terms of some new innovative weapons. And in this regard, no one should have any doubts that any direct attack against Russia would lead to any dangerous circumstances for any potential aggressor and to their defeat. Military technology is evolving very fast. Now, if we allow any deployment of military systems near our borders, well, these systems will stay there for decades, and they will create an absolutely unacceptable threat. As NATO is moving to the east, the security for Russia is getting more and more dangerous. And NATO has been saying that they need to bring its infrastructure to Russia as fast as possible. So they've been toughening up their talk. We can't just sit idly by. It would be completely irresponsible for us. Further deployment of NATO infrastructure and the deployment of weapons in Ukraine is unacceptable. Definitely NATO is the tool in foreign policy of the US. On our historic lands, we have anti-Russian systems, anti-Russian forces. They receive NATO military weapons, the latest cutting-edge weapons. And the US and its allies are pursuing the containment policy for Russia. And for us, it's an existential threat. Die or live. It's about the destiny of us as a nation. It's no exaggeration. It's a real threat to our interests and to our very existence, to our sovereignty, the existence of our state. That's the red line that I've mentioned earlier very often. They've crossed that line. In this regard, now on the Donbass, what we're seeing is that the forces that led a coup d'etat in 2014, have captured power and they've been preserving it through some declarative procedures. They don't want to see any peaceful resolution in the Donbass. For 8 years, long 8 years, we've done everything to address the situation through peaceful political forces. It's all been in vain. Now, as I said in my previous address, we cannot just sit idly by and watch the tragedy unfolding. We cannot just be patient. We had to stop that nightmare genocide against millions of people who pin their hopes entirely on Russia, on us. These aspirations, the pain of the people have been the key motive behind the decision to recognize the People's Republics in the Donbass. What should we highlight? Leading NATO countries have supported extreme nationalists and neo-Nazi pursuing their goals. And those forces in Ukraine will never forgive Crimeans for their free choice, and they will push for Crimea, and just like they did in the Donbass, they will push for a war there. Just like the Hitlerites' bands in Ukraine killed local people in World War II, and they also lay claims to some other Russian territories. The intelligence we receive is that a clash against these Nazi forces is inevitable. It's just a matter of time. They are biding their time. And now they're also saying they want nuclear power. They want nuclear weapons. We will not let them do it. As I said, Russia accepted new geopolitical realities following the collapse of the Soviet Union. We will respect any new nations in the post-Soviet territory. We will respect their territory, and we do respect it. And one of the examples is the assistance we extended to Kazakhstan that faced a tragic situation and a challenge to its territorial sovereignty, integrity and sovereignty. Russia cannot exist having a permanent threat coming from modern Ukraine. We all remember that in the noughties, in 2005, we put up resistance to terrorists in the Caucasus. We preserved Russia. In 2014, we supported Crimea, people of Crimea and the Sevastopol. In 2017, we put up a shield against the terrorists from Syria. We have no other choice. We had no other choice to defend ourselves. The same is happening right now. We simply we simply don't have any other choice to protect our people, and we'll have to use the only available choice that we will use today. The circumstances require immediate, resolute action. People's republics of the Donbass have requested assistance from Russia. In this regard, in line with Article 51.7 of the UN Charter, with the authorization of the Parliament of Russia, and in exercising the Treaty on Friendship and Mutual Assistance with the Donetsk People's Republics and Lugansk People's Republics, I've taken the decision to conduct a special military operation. Its purpose is to protect people who have been subject to abuse and genocide by the Kiev regime for 8 years. And to do this, we will strive to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, and also bring to justice those who have committed numerous bloody crimes against civilians, including citizens of the Russian Federation. We don't have any plans to occupy Ukrainian territories. We don't want to force anything on anyone. But we've heard claims in the West that the documents signed by the Soviet totalitarian regime about the outcomes of World War II should not be actually implemented. Well, what can I say to that? The outcomes of World War II, just like the tragedy and the losses and casualties by the Soviet Union, is a sacred thing. And it doesn't run counter to the sacred rights, human rights, based on the realities that we have. Again, every nation has the right to self-determination, like it's outlined in Article 1 of the UN Charter. People who lived in Ukraine have never been asked of how they want to set up their country, to live in their country. And we have the right to shape our own future and the right for our posterity. And we want to have the same rights for every person who lives in modern Ukraine. And I'd like to address the people of Ukraine. In 2014, Russia had to protect the people of Crimea and Sevastopol from those who you call themselves neo-Nazi. Crimeans wanted to stay with their historical homeland, Russia, and we supported that. We couldn't have done otherwise. What we're seeing today is not to undermine the interests of Ukrainians. We want to protect Russia against those who've taken Ukraine hostage and tried to use it as a proxy against Russia and our nation. But repeat, what we do is self-defense against the threats that are being created against us and against an even higher tragedy than the one happening right now. It might be really hard for you, but please understand us. Let's work together to turn over this tragic page as soon as possible and move ahead together, not to allow anyone to intervene in our relations, and to work together in a way so that would be an opportunity to overcome any issues. And despite any state borders, it would still help us to be stronger. I believe in this future. I'd like to address the armed forces of Ukraine. Comrades, your fathers and grandfathers fought against Nazis, defending our common motherland. This is why I don't think you like that neo-Nazis captured the power, and you pledged your oath of allegiance to the Ukrainian nation and not to the junta, the illegitimate junta. Don't follow its criminal orders. Please lay down your weapons and go home. I call on you to do that. All the Ukrainian soldiers that will do that will be able to leave the military zones and go back to their families without any barriers. Again, any responsibility on the bloodshed will lay entirely on the conscience of the Kiev regime. Now, a few important, very important words for those who may be tempted to interfere in the events taking place from the outside. Whoever tries to interfere with us, let alone create threats for our country, for our nation, must know that Russia's response will be immediate, and it will lead you to such consequences that you've never faced before in your history. We are prepared for any development. All the necessary decisions have been taken. I hope my call will be heard. Fellow Russians, well-being, existence of nations, their success and viability